Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Peter Beinart, a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is Tuesday, November 7th, 2023, and I'm delighted to be here with Ben Rhodes. Ben is a writer, political commentator, and national security analyst. He's the author of the New York Times bestsellers After the Fall, Being America and in the World We've Made, and The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House. He's currently co-host of Pod Save the World, a contributor to MSNBC, a senior advisor to former President Barack Obama, and chair of National Security Action. And I wanted to sit down with Ben because he knows better than almost anybody else kind of what it's like to be making American foreign policy in the middle of a crisis like this. And he has the kind of perspective of an insider, but also someone who has been willing to share his perspective really openly and honestly, even when he disagrees with what some of his former colleagues are doing, and that's something that I've really appreciated listening to him over the years. So Ben, thanks for doing this.
No, thanks, Peter. It's good talking to you.
So I guess maybe just if you could just give a little bit of a sense of kind of like, so something like October 7th happens, just a kind of a horrifying crisis, not just on a human level, but something that's obviously going to have massive implications geopolitically. I'm just kind of like, what's it like to be right inside the belly of the beast of kind of White House foreign policy machinery when something like that happens?
Well, it is it's interesting in a job like that, you're usually going from crisis to crisis. Your attention is consumed by things that are unexpected, things that you don't control. And yet, every now and then, there's something that happens that is a different scale that everything is going to be different from that day on. And so I'm sure that on October 7th, as they got the initial reports, the first thing you're doing is trying to get your mind around what is happening, trying to get as many facts as you can in a chaotic situation, but then immediately starting to game out what's going to happen next. And that basically means probably really intensive contact with the Israeli government. Everybody who has any contact with the Israeli government is in touch with them. And then that filtering out to the region, and we'll get to that. I think the one thing I'd say, Peter, that people might not appreciate, right, is these people were going to be doing other things. So like Tony Blinken has probably spent, I don't know, 90% of his time on this since October 7th. All that is time that he's not spending on Ukraine or on other issues. Same thing would be true of probably his senior team of Jake Sullivan. So I think what people don't understand, it's both the amount of time that is going to go into this, and then it's the amount of time that you're not spending on other things that has to be backfilled by other people. This type of issue, well, mainly this issue more than any other issue, is even more intense because not only are you dealing with a foreign policy challenge, it's an American political issue. Like, let's be frank about this. And so far more than other issues, you're probably hearing from constituency groups, from members of Congress. There's much more intensive media interest on this than most other international crises. And so this is an all-consuming event for the White House, probably for the last month, and for the senior leadership of the State Department and other agencies. And it feels like it's going to be that way. I mean, I lived through a couple of Gaza wars myself in government. This is just of a different scale.
And so obviously pretty soon, after the event, the U.S. has to start making decisions about what its policy is, right? I mean, pretty soon afterwards, it was pretty clear the Biden administration's initial policy was, we stand with Israel in their response to this terrible attack, and we're going to support it, basically. I mean, that's evolved a little bit, but that was the initial kind of decision. Is there some kind of formal process, like some kind of principals meetings or president, or is it kind of more informal than this, that you get to this initial policy outcome?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting because obviously right after October 7th, your first impulse and requirement is obviously to express solidarity and horror at what had taken place. And anybody would have done that. I think just about any US president would have done that. However, you're right that in the first, I don't know, between the attacks and Biden's decision to travel to Israel, that window, which was a few days, a decision was made beyond just expressing solidarity in the attacks. A decision was made to kind of fully embrace Israel, to have no public daylight between the United States and the Netanyahu government, to have the president of the United States go over there, which gives us a degree of ownership over everything that was going to happen after that, to signal that you were going to solicit a huge package from Congress. That was a decision, right? And I think that was a presidential decision, is what I feel intuitively. Because yes, there would be, there's situation room meetings probably all day long. The main conference, the situation room is probably filled with either the principals committee, that's cabinet level people, the deputies committee, which is the people underneath that teeing things up, and then working level people on these issues at other times. And they're probably teeing up options for different ways to respond. But that option it's kind of like a menu of things. What do we do here? Who's talking to the Qataris about the hostages? Who's talking to the Egyptians about the Rafah crossing? Who's talking to the Jordanians about the West Bank? Who's talking about the Europeans about what they're doing? All these little pieces of what is a much bigger puzzle. My sense is that Joe Biden sent a message down. It didn't come up. We are going to be backing Israel full tilt, full stop. And that then kind of shaped what the US government did around this. Joe Biden, under Obama, I think Biden sometimes felt like that Obama himself and some of his advisors like me were in a different place than he might have been. It's not that he loved Bibi Netanyahu, although he often says he does. It's that Joe Biden subscribes to a view, that Dennis Ross and others, I think, have popularized.
Right.
The way to get Israel to do something is to hug it as tight as you possibly can.
Right.
And that by embracing Israel and having absolutely no daylight between you and Israel in public, you can therefore have some more influence with them privately. Obama was more willing to, including in past Gaza wars, criticize things publicly that he didn't like, that he saw the Netanyahu government doing. I think this crisis was Joe Biden saying, I'm going with the hug Israel, hug Bibi approach completely. And basically the rest of the government's going to have to figure out how to run that play to get things done.
Right. And it seems like the corollary, that idea is that if you hug Israel close, you kind of win credibility with Jewish Israelis, especially in this moment of trauma. Then that gives you some space behind the scenes or whatever, maybe to try to kind of rein Israel in from doing things that you think might be destructive or damaging. What's your analysis of how, if that's been the theory of the case, of whether you think that they have been able to restrain Israel at all in as part of this, if you think they've been trying?
Sorry. The short answer is that I don't think that it's worked in terms of having much impact on Israeli decision making. I'll come back to that though, because I'm sure that they might disagree with that. I do want to say that there's a couple of reasons why you might want to have some distinction between the U.S. and Israel in terms of policy matters. There's the question of Israeli decision making, which I'll come back to. There's also the global audience, right? And I think in the Obama years, part of what we had our eye on was, we are going to be more critical if Israel bombs a school in Gaza, not because we necessarily think that that's going to cause Netanyahu to stop doing certain things, but because we want the world to understand, that's not how we would be doing things, And so, to me, my part of the calculus that I always tried to bring to these discussions was there's an audience of Jewish Israelis, absolutely. The whole world is watching this stuff really closely. And so the whole world now is going to associate the United States with whatever Israel does in Gaza. And that's, by the way, not going to change. I think that was cemented, when Joe Biden went over there, he literally gets briefed by the war cabinet, and certainly if we pass in a supplemental package.
A lot of them are weapons.
Calibration are weapons, right? So calibrations around calling for humanitarian pauses, the rest of the world isn't seeing that and saying, aha, see, they don't support this. So that's one, to those who might say, well, why wouldn't you just fully embrace the Netanyahu government in this instance? Because you're not going to affect them either way. There's more than one audience here. In terms of what the Biden people have done, is what you can tell is that I think they did succeed. So I want to be fair here. I think that it felt like Israel slowed down a little bit after Biden went over there. I think he asked a lot of questions. that they didn't have answers to.
Right.
And I think that they wanted time to try to negotiate some hostage releases through Qatar. I think they wanted time to set up some capacity to get humanitarian aid across the Rafah crossing. And they also just kind of wanted Israel to think through this ground invasion a little bit more before it went forward. And again, to be fair to the Biden people, that seemed to have happened. They got some, very little, hostages out. They got that border crossing at least not open, but they began to have some aid delivered in,
Right.
and before the ground invasion began. So I think that they did have a degree of influence. I think what they didn't influence was the fact that Israel's objectives in this military operation are fundamentally maximalist. It's the full destruction of Hamas, which is going to necessitate, as Netanyahu said yesterday,
right,
basically the de facto reoccupation of Gaza, and Israeli administration of Gaza for an indeterminate period of time, which runs directly counter to something Joe Biden said publicly. And I'm very sympathetic to the Biden people because Bibi Netanyahu doesn't really listen to anybody, certainly not like the American president. And so I don't suggest being critical of him would have been better,
right?
Except for the global audience I spoke about. Like I think at the end of the day, Netanyahu and this government are going to do what they, I think, want to do, with maybe some openness to U.S. suggestions around the edges,
right.
A little humanitarian aid in, a little more negotiation around the hostages. But fundamentally, I think what they've signaled is their intention to go forward with this military operation in any case.
Right. It seems to me that one thing that made this moment different from past crises between Israel and Gaza was almost from the beginning, people saw the possibility that it could create a regional war that could even draw on the United States. And then, so the U.S. sent in these aircraft carriers, and and obviously that seemed to be looming quite large, I would imagine, for the Biden administration set of concerns. I'm just wondering what you think the Biden administration might have been doing, what kind of conversations it might have been trying to have with the Iranians, with Hezbollah, even maybe through proxies, in order to try to avoid that ultimate kind of nightmare scenario.
No, it does feel to me like that was like the top priority for American diplomacy in the first couple of weeks. So what the United States, you sit in a situation room and you kind of have a hierarchy, what are we concerned about here? What are we worried about? And I think like the number one thing in those initial days was we don't want this to become a regional war that draws in Hezbollah, Iranian proxies, and maybe even Iran itself. And then because then the US is in that war. And so I think I bet the thing that they would argue privately that, it's hard for them to argue publicly is that we have succeeded thus far in preventing a regional escalation because there was a deterrent message of all that, those aircraft carriers that went. But then you'll recall that there were these Iranian proxy kind of strikes on U.S. Forces in Syria and to some extent Iraq. And then there was an American airstrike on IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard posts in Syria. There was this kind of messaging happening back and forth between Iran and the U.S. that seems to, for the time being, have held the regional escalation at a low boil. So Hezbollah's kind of in northern Israel, but not really. And the Nasrallah speech, the speech from the leader of Hezbollah the other day, stopped short of saying we're going to come into this war.
Right.
And Tony Blinken's, I'm sure in terms of the messaging to Iran, the U.S. has some direct channels with Iran, but I'm sure that the other thing that Tony Blinken and others are doing is using everybody who does have a line into Iran to tell them just stay out of this. We don't, and to say we don't want a war, and neither should you.
Right.
And whether that's the Omanis, whether that's Qatar, whether that's China, I'm sure that the U.S. has been really working hard to prevent that regional escalation. Now, I'm not certain we're out of the woods on that yet, Peter. And this thing could still escalate. I think people keep failing to recognize that the worst may not be behind us. The worst is in terms, I think, of Hamas attacks on Israelis. Let's hope, obviously. But in terms of regional escalation, I think this is still an open question, and it's probably a top U.S. priority.
Right. So this is obviously also, as you alluded to at the beginning, an international crisis where there's tremendous American political attention, and there's been a lot of discussion, in the last week or so about the political implications of this for Joe Biden's reelection campaign. Right? It's a really seems like kind of a no-win situation for him politically. I'm curious, like, in what ways, if at all, are there ways for people who are political advisors who are thinking about the politics of this and what it's going to mean for Joe Biden's ability to defeat Donald Trump to engage in that conversation? Does that happen at all? And if so, how?
Yeah, this is definitely a no-win situation. So again, I want to preface everything with that, because as anybody who's listening to this podcast, to make some judgments or assumptions about your listeners, you've all probably experienced in your own life that there's no way to make everybody happy with what you say about this issue. And that's certainly true of the president of the United States. That said, I do think, as with the decision to kind of hug Bibi out of the gate, the message you said at the beginning kind of sets a tone, and the message that Biden sent clearly was, the one of full solidarity with Israel, which was tremendously, I think, well received in Israel and among most of the American Jewish community, and people who are supporters of Israel in this country. However, there wasn't much accompanying messaging to Arab and Palestinian Americans, Muslim Americans, younger voters who are really deeply concerned about justice issues, including obviously civilian casualties in Palestine and Gaza, and so they kind of, I think, are in a position now where they have a real political challenge on their hands, which again, like I said, they were going to have anyway.
Right.
Now, Obama had this. Obama would often try to calibrate, and he did this recently, by speaking to all the narratives, right? Speaking to how everybody's feeling,
right? And
that usually you would get us a bunch of grief on the right or from kind of elements of the organized American Jewish community like AIPAC. But it was possible for even people that thought we should have been doing much more to help the Palestinians, or thought we were doing way too much for Israel, they could kind of look at Obama and say, I know that guy doesn't get along with Bibi. I know that guy sees Palestinians. I know that guy believes that a Palestinian life is equal to an Israeli life or an American life. And so it created space to at least have conversations with certain constituencies. I think the worst thing that Joe Biden has said since the beginning of this conflict is when he said he didn't believe the Palestinian death count.
Right.
And he didn't say, I don't believe the Hamas-run health ministry's death count. He said, I don't believe the Palestinian death count.
Right.
And I think that speaks to a lack of fully understanding just how visceral the reason this is a political issue, I think, is that it'll affect the election if they don't address it. I talked to, as you do, I think, Peter, I talked to a lot of Arab and Muslim Americans. I talked to a lot of young people. This isn't like a small issue to them, because they see this as indicative of a broader approach to politics and foreign policy and even domestic policy that doesn't see the valuation of the life of a Palestinian child. And so it's not just about Israel policy. It's about something bigger. And so I think what they need to do to address it is they have to speak very directly to why those people feel that way. They need to find credible messengers to speak to them, because it might be hard for Joe Biden to be that credible messenger. And I can't tell you exactly who that is, but they better find it, because I think I'm not of the view that, a year from now, a young Arab voter in Michigan is going to be like, what, I was really mad about this when it happened, but Trump's really bad, and so therefore I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. That's not the feeling I'm getting in talking to people. And so I think they've got real work to do to convince pretty big chunks of the Democratic electorate, including the ones that they already were having problems with, young people and voters of color, that they don't just understand that they're mad, they understand why they're mad.
Right, right. It seems like, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has been, now doing, running around the region a lot. I wonder to what degree, I mean, obviously you said that, the Biden administration was asking, or Joe Biden was asking questions about what comes next after you go into Gaza and depose Hamas. And I wonder to what degree, if you think the Biden administration is going to really try to invest in some political effort that would create some kind of horizon for Palestinians once, after Hamas is deposed. Like, I mean, they're now kind of stuck holding this thing, which they've obviously not really wanted to get in the middle of. And I wonder what you think they're going to try to do with that's now been kind of dumped in their lap in some ways.
Yeah, I think that they're probably giving a lot of thought to this, because I think obviously they're aware the challenges I've identified beyond even just Israel-Palestine is that if this goes like the way it appears like it's going to go, a multi-month Israeli ground operation in Gaza, resulting in kind of an Israeli reoccupation of Gaza to some extent, with a lot of civilian death. There's going to be the political issues we just talked about at home, but there's going to be real blowback against America globally. This make everything else that they're doing harder, from Ukraine. The global South was already checked out on Ukraine. And the message from the global South on Ukraine was, why do you care so much about these white people in Ukraine when you don't seem to care about the things that we're concerned about? That was before Gaza. Can you imagine what this is going to be like in a few months?
Yes.
And so I think the administration, if they can't really have much impact on except around the margins and trying to limit escalation, which is really important, I don't want to diminish that, they must be thinking what we're going to have to do next year is we're going to have to show a real political horizon for a Palestinian state, for Palestinian self-determination, for reconstruction in Gaza, to kind of build back some credibility globally and maybe, domestically with certain constituencies. I think that the shortcut to that is, can you get a massive Arab investment in, the Abraham Accords that kind of cut the Palestinians out? Can you kind of go back to the drawing board and do, frankly, what should have been the Abraham Accords, which is, can you go to the Gulf countries and say, can you build Gaza? Can you build a different Palestinian leadership? So that there's a coherent horizon. The challenge with that, Peter, as you know, is that Israel has to be okay with that. So this will require a lot of diplomacy to basically say, we actually want to build a different Palestinian leadership and a different Palestinian society that it creates a political horizon that restores dignity for Palestinians, that addresses a humanitarian crisis. And you hear this in the administration's messaging. The two-state solution is kind of returned as a front burner talking point, but they're going to have to persuade Israel. I mean, at the end of the day, if Israel doesn't allow that kind of assistance to come into the West Bank and Gaza, and expresses no interest in ever having a Palestinian partner, then it doesn't really lead anywhere, right? And so I think they're going to make a real run at this, because it's really going to implicate American interests here too. If this goes the way it's currently going, I think people are underestimating how damaging it might be to other U.S. interests globally. You can already feel Russia and China stirring pots. I mean, honestly, like Peter, I look at my own social media account. I guarantee Russia and China are in the information space. They want to turn us against each other. And they're doing that globally. And so I think there's an imperative from a U.S. interest standpoint. I mean, I think we should be doing it anyway, to really lean into trying to create a horizon for a Palestinian self-determination and dignity.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, it really frustrates me, frankly, that some, I won't mention names, but there's some very, very high profile Ukraine hawks who it seems to me are clearly smart enough to understand that U.S. policy towards Palestinians undermines Ukraine's cause because it makes America look like such hypocrites.
100%.
Right. And I wonder why those people maybe don't say that, because it just, even if you don't care about the Palestinians, right? If you care about Ukraine and you care about the idea of America having any credibility, the idea that you stop speaking when it comes to this issue seems to me really self-defeating. But I had one last question. It has to do with what kind of space there is inside the highest echelons of U.S. government in crises like this for essentially, frankly, moral arguments. I mean, imagine you're talking about what people outside in the country are thinking. A lot of the, imagine there are a lot of people inside the Biden administration, including maybe at high places, who maybe, in a quiet moment, maybe when they're back at home, if they ever have time, look at one of these shots of a building being taken down, of children, of 4,000 children dying, and thinking like, what is this? Like, why am I part of this machinery that's doing these terrible, terrible things? Like, I didn't get into government to do this, right? Like, and I just wonder, like, is there any, I know in politics, people, is there any space to basically just speak in those terms in the foreign policy making process, and basically just say, like, this is not morally, this is wrong for the US to be basically giving the weapons and the political cover for this kind of stuff to be happening? Or does that immediately make you basically, someone who's basically no longer taken seriously?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked. We just spent a minute on this. I mean, because there are different dimensions of this. So first of all, when I was in government, that happened on this issue all the time. Like during the last Gaza war in 2014. The dynamic in the White House when this is going on is in this case in the Obama administration, which was, had a Black president who was relatively young person to be in that position. There's a huge generational divide. So you're in the situation room, but this is the kind of conflict that everybody has a feeling about. And some people, think that's unfair and that singles out Israel, but I mean, there's a reason why, right? I mean, this is 3 major religions have, deep connectivity to this land. The U.S. provides over $3 billion a year to support the Israeli military. So it's not like we're some disinterested actor observing a distant war. Like, we are a party to this, right? And so I remember lots of really intense, I would basically leave a situation room meeting, Peter, and come back to my office and have a whole other meeting with a bunch of furious young, staffers, angry at me, even though in the meeting I thought I was the one pushing the envelope. And then I come back and I've got, I had Muslim staff and I had, young people work for me. I'm going to quit. How can we not call this out? Right. They're on the TV screen in my office on mute is like a pile of rubble in Gaza. Right. And by the way, nowhere near the destruction of this latest episode in Gaza. And obviously nothing like the horror of the Hamas attacks. Yeah. And so, yes, there are a lot of moral conversations that happen. My sense here is that this has probably been quite challenging for them because Biden, there's the same challenge we've all had in our own families and communities with this. There is a moral case that everybody can make here. Like the moral case that what Hamas did is absolutely horrific and intolerable, and people should not be expected to live adjacent to a group of people that would do that to them, is a very clear moral case that Joe Biden has made. There is also a moral case that killing 4,000 children and bombing a refugee camp and cutting off access to food and fuel to children and telling people to move to the south of Gaza and then bombing the south of Gaza, that those things are not moral. And my sense is that there's probably a lot of inner turmoil. There always is for people that work in the U.S. government during this time. These are well-meaning people. Very few people, if any, go into this line of work because they want to be a part of, what we're seeing happening in Gaza. Right. And so I think there's probably a lot of these conversations happening behind closed doors, or when people get home at night, or in people's heads. And to me, I wish there were more of it too, because you can rationalize a lot of things,
right,
when you're in these positions. I used to do that. You can say to yourself, well, this is horrible, but it could be worse. We got 20 trucks into Gaza,
right,
and that can seem like a big achievement, and I even see the administration presenting it, thanks to U.S. leadership, 20 trucks got into Gaza or 100 trucks got into Gaza, and you can feel understandable pride in that,
right,
without realizing what that looks like,
right,
to basically everybody else, who's looking at this and saying, what about the 2 million people that need 1,000 trucks and need bombs to stop falling on them, And so I wish there was more moral debate. I think there should be channels, for dissent to come up, and because you have to be forced to interrogate not your performance against the worst case scenarios that haven't happened, but like the moral standards that you want to hold yourself and U.S. allies to. And in this case, we could stand to have a little bit more of that. I mean, I hope that they're listening to Palestinian voices. I hope that they are, because that's the other thing is like, is anybody talk to anybody like a Palestinian in Gaza like that? I hope that they have reporting on that, on what it is actually like there, so that you're forced to kind of consider not where you are versus like the worst. Bibi's really good at this, by the way. Like Bibi used to do this with us to some extent. He makes you fear some even worse outcome, so that then the thing he ends up doing feels like not as extreme as like the thing he could have done,
Right.
And I bet that's happening here a bit too. And so I do just hope that there's space for those kind of moral conversations you're speaking about.
Yeah. Ben, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter. Always good to talk to you.
Yeah, and I want to thank our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMVP website, fmvp.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other great content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you are subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and you can also watch videos or versions of our podcast, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I'm Peter Beinart signing out until the next episode of FMVP's Occupied Thoughts.